Hello, good day, MST 191 students. I am Associate Professor May Joan Aguila from the Institute of Chemistry, UPLB. And in this video lecture, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the general strategies in chemistry research. First off, let's clarify why do we need to do chemistry research in secondary education, so in high school. Aside from, I believe it is already required, especially for those who are in the STEM curriculum. We need to take note that research will always be the pursuit of new knowledge through the process of discovery. And since you as our future science teachers, it is your responsibility to intrigue them towards science. And since research is the practical aspect of the theories that they will learn in the lecture part, it is quite important to show them the direction as to, or the application of these theories to maintain their interest in science. So for research, there are generally two types. Basic research, which is the main goal is to get a deeper understanding of the subject or the study, even without a certain application in mind. We just want to put forth everything that should be learned about the study. Applied research, on the other hand, is somewhat already directed in a way that we're still generating knowledge and we're still deepening the understanding about a certain subject, but this is already towards a certain application. So how do we usually conduct research? I know you're already quite familiar with this. So in the overall, there are three general steps, although you might think, or some references might further dissect it into 5 or into 7. The general steps include, first one, the proposal writing. So this is, so what is the research about? Who will be conducting the research, or you can also say who will benefit from the research? When will it be conducted? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing the research, or why should we do the research, and how? How should we do the research? And then the experimentation part, which is essentially the bulk of things. This is gathering data, gathering results. Okay? And then report writing, which includes interpretation of the data, and then putting forth conclusion. And then sometimes we also include recommendations, future directions of the research. So in high school, I believe the research is more commonly called as Science Investigatory Project, or SIP. And in this blog site, they define SIP as the science-based research project typically performed by school children. So in that sense, there are some key factors to consider. So it is science-based, so data-driven, so systematic, determination or systematic investigation. The concept of performed by school children means that the level of understanding that is necessary should be within their level, and we should not expect otherwise. So the main aim of science investigatory project is actually to engage the learners into science, to accept science, to love science, and essentially be introduce to them the concept of scientific research process. That a scientific research process is not out of the blue, it's not random, it is systematic. In the Phil Have YouTube channel, you can find a video there that says the SIP or Science Investigatory Project Best Practices. So there is a talk or a sharing of two teachers from a high school from San Pablo about what they do. So you can gather some tips on their experiences. And actually, Sir Rolf Alomia prepared a talk in that video as well. And one thing that really captured my mind is his statement that research is not just Google search. So the science investigatory project that you're going to introduce to your students in the future should not just be going into an internet shop or logging into their computers and just firing up Google and doing the search. That's not the research that we are referring to. We are actually already familiar with what or how to conduct a research, and this is called the scientific method. So I believe even in latter elementary days, we've already been introduced to the scientific method. So the scientific method is defined as the process of observing, asking questions, seeking answers through tests and experiments. And basically, in scientific research, we want to gain new knowledge about a subject, or we want to amend outdated or incorrect information, or we wanted to integrate the new information with what has been previously known. Okay, so those are the three aspects of knowledge that we gather from a scientific method. And we typically see when you Google, okay, so we did a little bit of quote unquote research. So if you typically see or Google scientific method, or you check textbooks from high school, elementary, what scientific method is, it can be 5 steps or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps, depending on some of these are actually being combined or so. It generally involves observation or asking questions. So something that has intrigued you, and then doing a little bit of research about the questions that you have, formulating your hypothesis. Okay, so what do we think is the reason, or in this case, the outcome to the problem, doing experimentation, collecting data, these three, experimentation, collecting data, these two. So you need to have a systematic procedure on how to do experiment. It is not just, oh, I wanted to do this, I will perform it. Okay, it's not something like that. Collecting data, so recording the results of the experiment, analysis and conclusion. So analysis and then basically conclusion, comparing if it did matches up your hypothesis. So sometimes the scientific method is treated to be as follows. So maybe in your level later, in high school level, this might be as linear as we can see because of, say, the time constraint or the depth of the study that you're doing. But it is important to really emphasize that the scientific method is not linear. It is iterative. So it is circular. So we have, of course, the research question, generating hypothesis, doing experimentation, analyzing the results, and then drawing conclusions, And then in the drawing conclusions, you can get two conclusions. Either it supports the hypothesis or it did not. So if it supports the hypothesis, well and behold, you'll be able to do the report already or publication of the results. If it doesn't match up with the hypothesis, we need to go back in the cycle and then either generate new questions or better questions or generate better hypotheses. Okay, and then so on. Okay, so the non-linearity of the scientific methods is very important. And this is usually what happens in the bigger scale. So we're not actually just limited in the reporting of results. That's why also we're recommending something because that suggests that there's another avenue or branching of the research questions that we originally had. So some tips in this scientific method, okay, although in general, it is not really as stringent in the step as like this, particularly if you do say your thesis, okay, or your special problem, but generally you'll be generating questions, generating possible answers to the question, experimentation, gathering results, drawing conclusions, and then reporting. So some tips on the scientific method is particularly when you go about this in your future or with your future high school students is really to make it a fun way to learn about scientific research and the scientific process. So tell them to focus on interesting and challenging topics for them. It is not just because that is what everybody is doing, you need to do that, or you will tell your students to do that. So this is not playing favorites with the topic. So it is really that something that intrigued them, something that challenged their understanding, so the better. In this way, they will feel that their project is really unique and the idea are really from them and not from someone else. And then negative results. So later on, when they gather results, negative result is not necessarily wrong. So it still contributes to the knowledge about the topic. So you can say that that's something that we should not do or something like that with respect if it deals with a certain methodology that you followed and it give you negative results. So that's something that you can say maybe there's something wrong in the method. Okay. But generally, this will pose challenges in the original assumptions that we have, in the original hypothesis that we have. And this will dictate us to think about the hypothesis if it is logical in the first place. And this will give us more avenues to investigate. And then lastly, ask the advice of someone else, particularly someone more experienced. So this is where you will play a huge role as their SIP instructor. Okay, you are generally more experienced in this stuff, so they can learn from your experiences, or you can also consult. I believe they are allowed to consult scientists, professors in universities. So in fact, I encourage you to take advantage of that, particularly later if you will be employed in a high school that has a college or university, or you're near a college or university that's doing science research. You can ask their advice about the topic or the research proposal that you have. Okay. Next is, now that we know that scientific method is the way to do things, okay, how are we going to embark in the scientific method? So the observation, particularly if they're going to do something that intrigue them, so that may be something that they experience day to day. Okay, that's why it intrigued them or challenged them. So how will you know if it has been done already, or are there answers already for that certain questions that they may have? So you will know by doing literature review. This is essentially the background check. So what you will learn from literature review is what the problem really is. So maybe at the maybe at the start, they still have some idea about the problem, but they don't know yet the deeper um, connotation of the problem. So they will be able to be more equipped in defining the problem. Quite important is they will know what has been already done with regards to finding solutions to the problem that they think of having. And also, if they will encounter what has already been done, they will have an idea of what can still be done. So this builds up their proposal quite nice. So in these next slides, I will be focusing on what is literature review. So literature review, as defined by Fink, is a systematic, explicit, and reproducible method of identifying, evaluating, synthesizing the existing body of completed and recorded work produced by researchers, scholars, and practitioners. So this is, since scientific research is generation of knowledge, it is always important to consult the knowledge that has been put forth already and basically synthesize them on and figure out how we're going to make use of it in our research. So take note though that literature review is not just simply summarizing the different contents of the journal articles or whatnot that they found out. It is important to assess the content, compare, and contrast. So as the proposal that your students will prepare has more beef into it. Okay, it is a better written type of proposal. So of course, literature review is important in research because this is the journal as conversation. Okay? This is the way of asking for wisdom from another or more experienced researchers. So now the question would be, when do you need to do literature review? So when will you advise your student to do literature review? Is it in the beginning, during the proposal stage? Is it in the middle, during the experimentation stage, or at the end, during the report writing or defense if you have stage? In fact, it is not, it is at any of this stage. So you can do it at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. So for the complete picture of what you want to do, what you're doing or what you have done, and what do you think would be the future direction, you need to do literature review at all steps. So it is on itself an iterative process. So literature review, you're asking research questions, you're formulating your objective, you're designing your methods, you're interpreting your results, and you're making conclusions. at all these steps, you need to validate it with literature. So how do you do literature search? It can be traditional or digital. So all the printed materials are usually considered now as traditional literature search, but this is generally time consuming and often not up to date. Although this is the ones that are quite easier to use because you just need to basically borrow or recopy the printed version and you have it on your own. The digital literature search all involves the digital versions, ebooks, online references, and so on. Sometimes this is confusing, particularly if the online platform is itself very confusing. You don't know what to look at once you are in the online platform. And usually it involves keyword search. So as you'll be directed in a more narrower, you'll be given a more narrower literature set, okay, if that's what you want. But this is often up to date and state of the art. So what do we typically use as search engines? I typically do right now digital search, and I typically use the Google Scholar. Generally, Google Scholar already have a summary of or a collection of the reading materials, and it has quite a variety of reading materials. So I usually try this one. But there are also some other way to do it. For example, PubMed, Scopus, the Web of Science, SciFinder, NCBI, the ERIC, the Cinehall, or the PsycInfo. The other ones are more health related, although Scopus, Web of Science, SciFinder are more of general in concept, but they need subscription, so these are not free. That's why I like Google Scholar more because this is relatively readily more accessible because it is also free. Okay, so I have it here a slide about the Google Scholar. So this is the website that you can direct. You will be directed to the Google Scholar. So it actually has journals in the scientific community. They are sorted in a particular timeline, or you can do a more refined search when you do your keyword search. So it is quite important to use vocabulary or jargons in the field to make it more directed. And you can also see citing reading materials. So once you go into the main article that you wanted, you can also check the citations or whoever cited that article, so as you can, that gives you an idea who else are actually using the information in that certain reference. In general, we encourage you to encourage your student to focus on peer-reviewed materials rather than, say, blogs or magazine articles. So peer-reviewed materials are written by experts and evaluated by experts. And this includes research papers, both the long article or communications, which basically the first report of research findings, review papers, which summarizes several research papers to make it more cohesive or a collection. And then what I typically do, for me, I focus first on the research paper. And then with that, I'm already quite directed on what research papers that I need to look out for. So I like reading the review papers first because it is already a summary and there's already a contrast comparison of the research papers, and from there I can nitpick which research paper I needed to read further. Another thing that is quite important, or maybe we're really limited because some of the journals are, some of these peer-reviewed materials are actually by subscription. We have what is known as the open access journal articles. So even in your teaching the lessons, I encourage you to incorporate journal articles in your teaching to make it really direct connection to real science. Okay, so your students can really see that what they're doing is real science. There's real science behind. There's a practical aspect of what they're learning. And these are typically the websites wherein you can access, or you can see these open access journal articles. In particular, I'm fond of using this directory of open access journal. So the DOA journal. So, and then maybe you can just search for a certain journal or search for a certain topic. Another thing that might not be familiar, even ourselves, we are not really quite familiar with it, are the patents. So patents are another important literature that we need to do. So we can do prior art search using patents, and patents actually give us an idea sometimes of what really is important. Okay, so because they are able to apply a patent for that, that means it has greater significance globally, or it has greater applications globally. Okay. So these are the two platforms that I typically use in searching for patents. So eSpaceNet or the WIFO. But to be honest, I'm more familiar with the platform, the eSpaceNet. So in here, you just need to put forth some keywords that will be included so that the platform can give you some patents as related to the keywords that you put into. So sometimes you can access the whole patent itself, or sometimes you can just be given access to the abstract of it. But still, reading the abstract, you'll be able to have an idea of what they did. But accessing the whole patent is actually better. So these are some tricks that I can share with you. So first, make it a habit, or you can share to your students, make it a habit. Make literature search as a habit. So as much as possible, you encourage your students to read as many research articles as they can. So to be familiar with the topic, to really learn what has been done already about the topic, and to have a better picture of what they can do about the topic. Be flexible. Sometimes, even though you're following strictly, say, a methodology from a certain journal article, sometimes it will not go as what is stated in there. So you need to be able to uh, find out how to make some changes so as you'll arrive at what you wanted to originally have, or maybe you need to change something in the methodology. And then be collaborative. So consultation with more experienced people, or even with your peer. So this aspect of consultation with peers is sometimes taken for granted, But take note, each of one of us is unique. So our understanding and interpretation may be different from the others. And it's quite important and give us a better picture if we know the others' interpretation as well. And lastly, be organized. Um, make a summary of the contents of the research articles. In the past, particularly when I was an undergrad and even in high school when I was doing my research, my literature review, I'm making index cards. I'm using index card and writing them the summary of the contents of each article that I read. So as when I write the report, it is already uh, on the index card. I will just read it and I'll be able to remember it more if if I'm seeing it. So the recall is quite easy to do. Okay, but you can do the index card, or you can tell the kids to make use of other way to do it. So it can also be like prepare it in Word, so summary, or in PowerPoint presentation. However, you want it to be right now. So it is quite important still to be organized. And now that we have done the literature review, so we already know what has been done and we've already found avenues of what to do. We are now ready to do the methodology. And the methodology is essentially the experimental design. So experimental design or proper experimental design is quite important, especially in the cases we're in. Time is an important factor in the research in establishing relationship of the cause and effect. Or when time is an invariable or never changing behavior between the cause and effect. And then when the researcher wishes to understand the importance of the cause and effect. So a proper and a good experimental design is quite important. Experimental design is defined as a framework of protocols and procedures for the conduct of experiment. And this is in particular important in quantitative type of research because usually in here, the scientific approach is using two sets of variables. One set of variables will be taken as the constant, and the other set of variables will be the one that has differences, okay? And these differences are measurable. So experimental design is important in establishing a quality decision-making procedure, in structuring the research, leading to easier data analysis, and basically to address the main research questions. So these are types of experimental designs. I'm not really going to look into this deeper. So we have the pre-experimental, so preliminary gathering of data to merit or to check if further investigation is still necessary. The true experimental research design usually involves statistical analysis and defining really your control group. And then you have quasi-experimental research design, which is similar to the true experimental design, although there's differences in the assignment in the control group. I believe experimental design is taught in your statistics, or you can also check this website. It has further definitions on what an experimental design is. Okay? But what I wanted to emphasize would be the advantages of a sound experimental design. Okay. So a sound experimental design gives you or allows you to use findings for similar ideas. It has a stronghold over variables. It has specific results, and it is generally an ideal starting point for further or for enriching your research. Okay. So researchers have a stronger hold over variables to obtain results. And the subject does not impact the effectiveness of the experimental design. If it is, if the experimental design is constructed properly, the results are specific. The findings from the same data set can be repurposed for similar research ideas. Experimental research makes an ideal starting point, and the collected data could be used as foundation to build new research ideas for further studies. So these are things that we need to watch out for in constructing our methodology or in our experimental design. So sometimes we have an invalid theoretical framework. In this sense, we need to check if the hypothesis itself in the first place is logical to be tested. If it is not, we need to rearrange and construct another hypothesis that is more logical. It has means to be tested. It's quite important that you have adequate literature study. If this is lacking, it will be difficult to identify where, what the current knowledge is, where you need to fill the knowledge gaps. Remember, your research or your student research should address the filling of the information gaps. So particularly for quantitative research, if you don't have, if you have an insufficient or incorrect statistical analysis. So the statistical results actually introduces quality to the data that you have in a quantitative research. So the way that we analyze your data depends on the statistical analysis that you use, if it is the correct one, or even if it is sufficient enough already. And then if we have undefined research problems, so the research problem that your student needs to do should be clear, especially since I think this is quite limited. In terms of the time length, they are really quite limited. Okay, so you really need to ask your students to have their problem really clear. So state their problem really clear and set the framework for the development of the research questions that address the core problems clearly. Another thing, although this might not be a mistake really, but you need to take note that there's always going to have research limitation. So one limitation that I mentioned is the time to do the research. Okay, so you need to consider those limitations in the design and later on in drawing conclusions. So you need to make sure that the limitations are taken care of, and if possible, if you are able to go around with these limitations in the design, the better, because that means that the conclusions that you have would be able to not include this limitation, or it has already an answer to this limitation. And then lastly, ethical implications. It is nice to start them young, your high school students, to think about risk in the things that they do. Okay, so you need to emphasize that they need to minimize any risk while performing or while addressing the research problem. So the ethical implications is quite important. And in fact, that is the next topic in this video lecture. So what really is ethics? So I found this in a blog site, and ethics is related to the following terms: morality, moral principles, integrity, honor, choice, conscience, fairness, responsibility, and so on. The Wikipedia definition of it is actually, it is a branch of philosophy that involves in systematizing, depending and recommending concepts of right over the wrong. Okay? So it is acquired through life. So it started at our individual houses, individual homes, and once you interact with other people, you've learned and you've learned and I would say develop your own ethics. Okay, so this is common, really, but maybe interpreted and applied differently. Particularly, say, um, if we have indigenous people, the ethics that they have are quite different from us because we don't know how they live their life as indigenous people. Okay. But when we talk about ethics in chemical research, this is really about research integrity. So you or your student as a researcher should be or should have integrity. The National Academy of Science and Technology in the Philippines, so they are uh, the highest and esteemed collection of scientists in the Philippines, so composed of academician and national scientists. Okay, so they have these ethical principles and guidelines for the Filipino scientists. So since your students are scientists in the making, science enthusiasts, it does not hurt to let them read these ethical principles and guidelines. So it is available, the last time I checked, in their website. So you can download it. So when we talk about research integrity or essentially ethics in chemical research, we need to check first research misconduct. Or sometimes really we're just focusing in this research misconduct. These are really sometimes grave in terms of extent. Okay. But you should take note that it is included in here some questionable research practices. So if you have a questionable research practice, that means you're testing ethics already. And ethics in chemical research deals on your individual ethical standpoint and community. So it can be a big community or even bigger community. So, but don't forget that start off with yourself or with with oneself, and then go on to others. Okay, I like to give this an example when we talk about ethics. So this is a movie line. These are movie lines from the Divergent movie. This scene is when this is four. So one of the character, four, and then Tris is not shown in here. So this character, Janine, okay, so he injected something into four, and now four is somewhat mind controlled. Okay, so if you read into the conversation, okay, read about it. And this highlighted like chemist because what happened here, so this is four is being mind controlled and doesn't recognize Tris, even though in the plot of the story, Tris and four are the ones who are working together and Janine is somewhat their enemy. So in this sense, uh, Janine said that he can't hear you. Amazing, isn't it? Everything we think of, what makes up a person, thoughts, emotions, history, all wiped away by chemistry. So you might be thinking that there's a certain gravity into this statement, but in reality, this is correct. Although maybe you're thinking chemistry, it does not really involve animals or human as subject, but if you go into the very tiny details of life, look into the biomolecules, those are actually chemistry. So those are dictated by chemistry. So this is actually. And another example is Alfred Nobel. He invented the nitroglycerin. And the idea here, actually, the Nobel family, they own landmines, mining industry. So they wanted to have a way of how to easily extract valuables or precious gems or whatever they're mining and break apart, say, a huge boulder of rock. And they use dynamite. So for that, the one that he invented. Unfortunately, come the war, if I'm not mistaken, this is World War One. They used dynamite in another purpose, and this is to kill another person. And with that, Nobel thought of course, he has a company. He has a dynamite making company. It benefited very well during the war because dynamite is used as a warfare. But after the war, he mentioned that the profit that he gathered would be used to establish a, a an incentivize scientists, people who think of how to greatest benefit mankind. And this is the Nobel Prize that we know. Right? So when we talk about research integrity, it actually greatly summarized in the Singapore Statement of Research Integrity. It's four aspects: honesty, accountability, professional courtesy, and good stewardship. So honesty is being thoughtful in all aspects of research. Accountability means taking responsibility for your actions as the researcher. Professional courtesy, treating others with respect. And good stewardship is using and managing research responsibly. So taking into consideration all of these aspects means that you're considering research integrity or the research that you're doing is of highest integrity. So these are some examples of you might think just a minor infractions. It's not really that grave. So should we be questioning the integrity and hence the ethics of the researcher? So keeping an incomplete record of research. So that already contradicts the concept of ads. Failure to report conflicting evidences, just looking into positive results and just disregarding negative results. That means you are not accountable for your results as a researcher. Not meeting deadlines. So you might say the student, they are just high school students. How can they exhibit professional courtesy? So if they set up meetings among themselves or distribution of tasks among themselves, they should be able to do the tasks that they were given to them as a sign of professional courtesy to others. And then good stewardship, for example, poor planning of the methodology to be used, and this resulted to failed products. So that's waste of time, waste of reagents, waste of everything. So that's in contrast to good stewardship. So as you can see in here, these are some minor infractions, but they are actually against what we call as having integrity in research. So that means this is already non-ethical laboratory practices. So ethics in the laboratory, we need to define good laboratory practices. So you might have encountered this when you were doing individual laboratories, say in biology, in chemistry, in math, in physics. They have their own set of laboratory guidelines, the do's and don'ts. Although I don't want it to say as do's and don'ts, guidelines is a little bit better. Okay. In bigger industry, they actually have they're following OECD guidelines, but if you're talking about a smaller laboratory, say a high school laboratory, you don't really need to follow everything in the OECD guidelines. But what you need to take note are the following. In a good laboratory practice, you're maintaining the quality of your data to the highest standard. So it is not really the quantity, but more of the quality. Because if you do the experiment considering good laboratory practice, you should not be questioning if your data is of low quality or not. So we need to think of human health and environment. Again, tell your students to not look further. Just take a look at themselves. So if performing the experiment, it might bring harm to themselves, so they need to caution about it. They need to take some actions on how to minimize or totally eliminate the harm. For example, if they are using or heating a test tube over an open flame, they will not essentially hold the test tube and put it in front of the open flame. What they will do is they will get a test tube holder, hold the test tube, and then put it in the open flame. Make sure that the opening of the test tube is away from them at the same time, away from anyone within the vicinity. That's already an example of good laboratory practice. So a simple one, applicable in a high school setup, but maintaining protection of human health. Okay. Now we need to consider environment as well because of the current changes that we have, say the climate change and so on. And then in relation to this, so you also need to consider the general safety in the laboratory. So this is of utmost importance. Another thing that relates to ethics in the laboratory is in the data management and reporting. So how do you handle data? How do you gather data? How do you handle data? And how do you report data? Okay. I'm sorry, I think I have a mistake over here. I forgot to change. So one thing that you should warn your student about is the falsification of data and results. Falsification means altering, omitting data, or manipulating results. So if it doesn't match the hypothesis that you wanted, that doesn't mean that the data are wrong. Either you just need to redo it, change something in the procedure, or your main hypothesis itself is a little bit faulty. So altering and omitting that. This should be plagiarism, not safety in the laboratory. So plagiarism is another aspect that unconsciously or consciously students may be involved in that greatly questions ethics. So plagiarism is the use and expression of ideas, concepts, methods, results, or statement of others without proper credit. I put in here or yourself without proper credit. So there is such a thing known as self-plagiarism. So that's why you are asked to paraphrase a certain, say, sentence that you already made because you are in the danger of self-plagiarism. So you're plagiarizing yours. Okay, so please emphasize that to your student. And I end my lecture on the general strategies in research in this slide. Thank you very much for listening. See you around.